They destroyed it. My entire cabin is gone. That was the only thought crashing through my mind as I stood there, my boots sinking slightly into the dirt where my family's lake retreat used to be. Just yesterday, that place had been alive with memories, the kind of memories that make life worth living. My father teaching me how to fish off the old wooden dock, my sister laughing around the fire pit as sparks floated up into the night sky, my nieces and nephews running across the porch with sticky fingers from roasted marshmallows. All of it, every single nail and board of history, had been bulldozed to the ground. Now, there was nothing left but a pile of broken wood, shattered glass, and the smell of sawdust mixed with diesel fuel still hanging in the air. And the worst part? It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a fire or a storm. It wasn't some tragic accident. No, it was deliberate. It was planned. And it was carried out by the very people who were supposed to protect the community, the homeowners association. If you've never dealt with an HOA, consider yourself lucky, because these people acted less like a group of neighbors trying to keep the community nice and more like a cartel, always circling, always threatening, always looking for ways to squeeze every ounce of control out of the people who just wanted to live in peace. And from the day I bought my cabin, I had been on their radar. They didn't like that I wasn't the type to roll over, to nod along when they threw out absurd rules about paint colors or lawn length or what time you were allowed to walk your dog. I paid my dues on time, I followed the real guidelines, but I refused to let them bully me into submission over nonsense. And for that, they marked me as their next target. I'll never forget the morning I got that first letter. It was printed in bold red ink across the top, final notice. I nearly laughed out loud because I hadn't even received a first notice. According to the letter, I owed $18,000 in unpaid HOA fees. $18,000. I sat at my kitchen table flipping through my neatly organized binder, every payment I'd ever made documented and stamped. I didn't owe them a cent. I could prove it. But the letter didn't care about proof. It didn't ask for clarification. It didn't even give me a contact to resolve it. It simply said that enforcement actions would be taken if I failed to pay within 10 days. I remember thinking they'd probably try to slap another fake fine on me, maybe restrict access to the community boat ramp, maybe put a lien on my cabin and try to squeeze me through legal threats. That's how these people operated, petty intimidation. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined at that moment, was how far they were willing to take it. That Friday started like any other. I went to work early, stopping for coffee, joking with my coworkers, going about my day. Meanwhile, a convoy of trucks and heavy machinery rolled into the lakeside community. Neighbors later told me the sound was deafening, engines roaring, metal grinding, commands being barked by the HOA president himself. People ran out of their homes in disbelief as they watched the demolition crew surround my cabin. Some tried to step in, shouting that it wasn't right, that there was no court order, no paperwork, nothing legal about what was happening. But the HOA president waved them off with arrogance dripping from every word. "Unpaid fees," he shouted. "We've got authority." Authority? Please. They had nothing but inflated egos and a hunger for power. By the time I got the call, it was too late. A neighbor's shaky voice broke the news: "They're tearing it down. Your cabin, they're tearing it down right now." I felt my chest tighten, my vision blur. I sped out of the city like a madman, ignoring speed limits, barely breathing, my hands locked on the steering wheel as if I could somehow hold the place together just by hanging on tight enough. But when I turned that last bend and the lake came into view, I knew I was too late. Where my cabin had stood proudly among the trees for decades, there was nothing left but rubble. The porch where I used to sit with my morning coffee? Flattened. The dock where I caught my first base with my dad? Torn apart. My bookshelves, my grandfather's chair, the photographs of generations of family gatherings, all reduced to dust, splinters, and twisted metal mixed with dirt. I stepped out of my truck, and for a moment, I couldn't even move. Neighbors stood at a distance, some filming on their phones, others shaking their heads in quiet sympathy. The HOA crew didn't even look ashamed. They packed up their machines, smug, self-satisfied, strutting like they had just done something noble. The president had the audacity to lock eyes with me and smirk, as if he was daring me to say something, to challenge his so-called authority. He thought he'd won. He thought he had taught me a lesson about who really held power in that community. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that my entire family works for the Department of Justice. My father, a seasoned federal prosecutor who has sent white-collar criminals to prison for decades. My sister, a sharp and relentless DOJ investigator who doesn't stop until she uncovers the truth. And me? A legal analyst who knows exactly how cases like this unravel when put under the microscope of real law, not HOA playground rules. As I stood there in the dust of what used to be my home, grief and anger mixing into something sharp and unstoppable, I realized this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Because they didn't just demolish a cabin. They triggered a storm they weren't prepared to face. They thought they could silence me with intimidation and destruction. Instead, they had just declared war against the wrong family. The truth is, the demolition of my cabin wasn't the first sign of how far this HOA was willing to go, it was just the most extreme. For months leading up to that moment, they had been testing me, pushing boundaries, trying every trick in their petty little handbook to break me down. It started with the grass. Yes, the grass. I got a notice one morning claiming that my front lawn was in violation of the community standards, because it was half an inch taller than their requirement. Half an inch. I remember standing out there with a ruler, measuring, shaking my head at the absurdity of it. But I trimmed it anyway, thinking maybe that would quiet them down. Of course, it didn't. The next month, they hit me with another violation, this time for my fishing dock. The dock had been there long before the HOA even existed, built back in the 1980s when my grandfather owned the property. It wasn't just a dock, it was a family landmark, a piece of history. Yet the HOA claimed it was unauthorized construction and demanded I remove it or face daily fines. I appealed, I showed them historical records, photos, proof that the dock was grandfathered in, but it didn't matter. They weren't interested in facts. They were interested in control. And that's when it hit me, they weren't just enforcing rules. They were targeting me. It was personal. Why? Maybe because I didn't bow down, because I didn't lick the boots of the HOA president like so many others in the neighborhood. Maybe because I wasn't afraid to question their nonsense during community meetings. Whatever the reason, I had become their favorite enemy. And instead of backing down, I dug in. I paid the legitimate fees on time, every single one of them, but I refused to pay the bogus fines. That's when the letters started piling up. Threatening language, bold red ink, big words like violation, final notice, and enforcement action. They slapped papers on my cabin door like I was some criminal. They sent emails late at night filled with veiled threats about what would happen if I didn't comply. My neighbors whispered to me that the board was having private meetings about me, plotting ways to handle the problem. I became the villain in their little power drama. Then came the most outrageous move of all, the fake debt. One morning I opened a letter claiming I owed $18,000 in unpaid HOA fees. $18,000. I almost laughed because it was so blatantly false. I had every receipt, every bank statement, proof that my dues had been paid in full for years. I even went back through my records just to be sure. And there it was, black and white proof that they were lying. I sent copies of everything back to them with a polite but firm letter explaining that I owed nothing and that if they continued harassing me, I would escalate legally. I thought that would shut them down. Instead, it only poured fuel on their fire. Suddenly, the harassment got worse. They started sending inspectors to my property, walking around like they owned the place, taking photos of my porch, my boat, even my trash cans. They issued new fines for nonsense, claiming my porch light was the wrong color, that my mailbox wasn't regulation size, that I had left a kayak leaned up against the cabin too long. Each fine was more ridiculous than the last, and each one came with threats of further enforcement. I ignored the bogus ones, paid the real ones, and documented everything. I wasn't stupid. I knew this was escalating towards something, I just didn't know how far they would go. Neighbors began warning me quietly. One older couple down the street whispered that the HOA president had been overheard saying he was going to make an example out of me. Another family hinted that the board had connections with local contractors and that if I wasn't careful, they might pull something extreme. I shrugged it off at first, thinking there was no way they'd cross the line that badly. After all, even corrupt HOAs usually stopped at liens or lawsuits. But I underestimated just how reckless, arrogant, and power-hungry this particular board really was. The day they demolished my cabin was the day I realized they had skipped every legal step, every requirement, every shred of due process. They didn't get a court order. They didn't notify the county. They didn't give me a real hearing. They simply declared me guilty of owing money I didn't owe and acted like judge, jury, and executioner. They marched in with bulldozers and wiped my family's history off the map in a single afternoon. And the smug look on the president's face when I arrived said everything. This wasn't about money. This was about power. He wanted to prove that no one could stand up to him, that the HOA was untouchable. He thought he had won. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't alone. My family wasn't just a bunch of ordinary homeowners struggling against the iron fist of an HOA board. We were the Department of Justice in flesh and blood. My father had built entire cases that toppled white-collar crime syndicates. My sister had uncovered million-dollar fraud schemes. And me? I knew every legal loophole, every protection, every single statute these people had trampled on. And as I stood there staring at the rubble of my cabin, my anger hardening into cold determination, I made a silent promise that they were going to regret every ounce of arrogance they had shown. Because now, it wasn't just about a cabin. It was about exposing a corrupt system, dragging every rotten member of that HOA into the light, and showing them what real justice looked like. They thought they had the power. They thought they could bulldoze my life and walk away smiling. But they had no idea the storm that was about to hit them. The moment I picked up the phone to call my family, everything shifted. Up until then, it had been me against the HOA, one homeowner standing alone against a board of bullies who thought they could bend the rules any way they wanted. But when I explained what happened, how they had demolished my cabin without a court order, how they had fabricated fake debts, how they had harassed me for months, my father's voice on the other end of the line went from shock to rage in seconds. He was a federal prosecutor, a man who had spent his entire career putting arrogant criminals in their place, and I could hear the steel in his tone when he said, "They just broke federal law. They don't even realize what they've stepped into." My sister, who worked as an investigator for the Department of Justice, didn't waste a moment either. Within hours she was digging into the HOA's financials, pulling records, requesting documents, tracing every dollar that had flowed in and out of their accounts. And as for me, I went into full analyst mode, pulling together everything I had documented over the past year, letters, fines, emails, neighbor statements, video recordings of the demolition, every scrap of evidence that showed a clear pattern of fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. What the HOA didn't realize was that their arrogance had blinded them to just how illegal their actions were. They thought tearing down a cabin was just a community enforcement. But in reality, they had committed a laundry list of crimes. Demolishing a private home without legal authority wasn't just wrong, it was destruction of property on a criminal level. Fabricating debts and billing me for money I didn't owe. That was fraud. Harassing me with threats and intimidation? That was coercion and abuse. Destroying the personal belongings inside my cabin, my furniture, family photographs, heirlooms? That wasn't just collateral damage, it was theft. And every single one of those crimes carried serious consequences. Within days, the ball was rolling. My father reached out to contacts in the U.S. Attorney's Office, explaining the situation in detail. My sister began compiling a dossier of the HOA's shady practices, and she uncovered something I hadn't even imagined. It turned out I wasn't their only victim. Dozens of families in the community had been hit with similar fake fees, trumped-up violations, and threats of foreclosure. Some had caved and paid just to keep the HOA off their backs. Others had quietly sold their homes and left, unable to take the stress. And in a few cases, the HOA had actually forced foreclosures on homeowners who couldn't afford to fight back. This wasn't just an overzealous board. This was a racket. A full-blown scheme to milk residents for money through intimidation and lies. The more my sister dug, the uglier it got. She found irregularities in the HOA's bank statements. Money that was supposed to be going toward community maintenance was instead being funneled into private accounts linked to the HOA president and his close allies. Landscaping contracts that were double-billed. Construction invoices for projects that never even happened. It was blatant, sloppy fraud, and they had gotten away with it for years because nobody had the resources or courage to challenge them. Until now. Meanwhile, I was carefully documenting every conversation I had with neighbors who had witnessed the demolition. Some had filmed the bulldozers tearing through my cabin, capturing the HOA president shouting orders and laughing as my property crumbled. Others had kept copies of their own bogus violation letters and fines. Piece by piece, a mountain of evidence was stacking up, and the higher it grew, the clearer it became that the HOA had crossed from civil disputes into full-blown criminal enterprise territory. What gave me the most fire wasn't just what they had done to me. It was realizing how many people had been living in fear under their thumb. Elderly couples too intimidated to speak up. Single parents paying money they didn't owe because they couldn't risk a fight. Families uprooted because the HOA made their lives unbearable. These board members weren't just bad neighbors. They were predators, feeding off the community they claimed to serve. And with the DOJ now circling, their little empire was about to come crashing down. It didn't take long for the investigation to heat up. Federal agents began showing up in the neighborhood, quietly interviewing residents, asking for documents, piecing together the puzzle. The HOA board members who had once strutted around like kings suddenly started looking over their shoulders, their cocky smiles replaced with nervous glances. Word spread fast that subpoenas had been issued, that accounts were being frozen, that investigators were crawling through every shred of paperwork the HOA had ever filed. The same people who had mocked me, who had laughed as my cabin was bulldozed, were now scrambling to hire lawyers, trying desperately to explain away years of corruption. But it was too late. The net was already closing in. I remember sitting at my sister's kitchen table late one night as we pored over files she had collected. She showed me a document that made my blood boil, proof that the HOA president had personally signed off on the demolition of my cabin, citing unpaid fees as justification, even though no court had ever approved it. He had written it like he was above the law, like his signature carried the weight of a judge's gavel. That piece of paper became the smoking gun, the undeniable proof that he had acted illegally, arrogantly, and with full intent. My father leaned back in his chair, tapped the page, and said, "This man's going to prison. Mark my words." And that's when it really sank in. They thought they had broken me, but in reality, they had handed me the very weapon that would destroy them. By overreaching, by letting their power trip cloud their judgment, they had given me everything I needed to bring the full weight of the Department of Justice crashing down on their heads. The day of reckoning came faster than anyone in the neighborhood expected. One moment, the HOA president and his little circle of board members were strutting around like they still owned the place, and the next, federal agents were rolling up with warrants in hand. I was standing there on the courthouse steps when I saw him being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and sweaty, the same man who once smirked at me as my cabin was demolished now looking like the walls of his world were closing in. He barked something about it being a misunderstanding, about how everything would be cleared up, but no one believed him. Not the officers, not the neighbors, not even his fellow board members who suddenly pretended they had nothing to do with him. The charges stacked against him read like a laundry list: fraud, racketeering, embezzlement, destruction of private property, abuse of authority. Each one heavier than the last. And he wasn't alone. Other board members who had signed off on the fake fines, the fraudulent billing, and the demolition order were also slapped with indictments. Some tried to cut deals, pointing fingers at one another, but the DOJ doesn't play games. When they move in to finish the job. For weeks, the entire community buzzed with shock. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out suddenly came forward with their own stories. People who had been quietly suffering under the HOA's intimidation finally realized they weren't alone, that justice was actually possible. Some of them even thanked me, saying that if my cabin hadn't been destroyed, none of this would have come to light. It was strange hearing that, knowing that my loss had become the spark that set everything in motion, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. Because this fight was never just about me. It was about tearing down the walls of fear that had trapped an entire neighborhood. The court proceedings dragged on for months, but I didn't mind. Every time I walked into that courtroom and saw the HOA board sitting there, stripped of their arrogance, reduced to desperate defendants trying to explain away years of corruption, I felt a little bit of closure. My father sat beside me through much of it, his presence a reminder of what real justice looked like. My sister's investigative work was presented as evidence, and it was bulletproof, line after line of financial records showing money siphoned off, contracts falsified, homeowners extorted. The judge's face grew darker with every revelation. This wasn't just petty HOA overreach. This was organized fraud at the community level, and the hammer of justice was ready to fall. When the verdicts finally came down, it was everything we hoped for. The president received a prison sentence that would keep him locked away for years, his empire of intimidation crumbling into dust. The other board members were fined heavily, banned from ever serving on any HOA again, and forced to repay thousands to the residents they had wronged. But the victory didn't stop there. Because of how flagrantly they had broken the law by demolishing my cabin, the court ordered them to pay me triple damages. That meant not only did I get compensated for the cabin itself, but for everything I had lost inside it: furniture, heirlooms, memories. The payout was enough for me to rebuild bigger and better than ever. And that's exactly what I did. Where my old cabin once stood, I built a new one. Stronger, larger, and more beautiful. I added a guest house so my family could always stay with me, a brand new dock with better access to the lake, and upgraded everything from the kitchen to the fire pit. The neighbors who had stood by me through it all came to celebrate when construction finished, and together we toasted not just a rebuilt cabin, but a community free from the chains of a corrupt HOA. Every time I sat on that new porch, looking out over the water, I thought about the arrogance of the men who thought they could break me. In the end, they had only given me more strength. But the true victory wasn't just in the money or the cabin. It was in seeing justice ripple through the community. Families who had been forced to pay bogus fines got their money back. Those who had been threatened with foreclosure had their records cleared. The fear that once hung over every meeting, every letter, every knock on the door was gone. The HOA itself was dissolved entirely, its name now a stain in the legal system, its leaders disgraced forever. And in its place, the residents came together to form a simple neighborhood committee, not a board of tyrants, just a group of neighbors looking out for each other the way it should have been all along. I can't count how many times people have asked me if I regret buying that cabin in the first place, if I regret all the stress, the loss, the fight that came with it. And every time, I give the same answer: not for a second. Because yes, losing the cabin was painful. Standing in the rubble that first day felt like my heart was being ripped out. But that pain turned into fire, and that fire turned into justice. If I hadn't gone through it, the corruption would have continued, the board would still be feeding off my neighbors, and no one would have dared to stand up. Instead, we all stood up together, and the result was bigger than I ever could have imagined. Now, when I sit by the water at sunset, listening to the quiet lapping of the lake against the dock, I feel peace again. Not just because I have a cabin back, not just because I won a legal battle, but because I know the people who thought they could destroy my life ended up destroying themselves. They wanted to prove I was powerless, but all they proved was that justice is bigger than arrogance, and truth is stronger than intimidation. And the lesson that remains for anyone listening is simple: never underestimate the strength of a person who knows the law, who refuses to bow down, and who has a family ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Because sometimes, the very people you think are your victims are the ones holding the power to bring you down. So to the HOA that thought bulldozing my cabin would silence me, let this be the reminder: they didn't bury me. They buried themselves.